good morning, or good afternoon, or perhaps good evening to everybody who is joining us for this important meeting today. Welcome to the SAIS African Studies Program Conference on U.S.-Africa Reengagement, a new foreign policy agenda. I'm Professor Peter Lewis, Director of Africa and Middle East Studies at SAIS. I'd like to, first of all, thank Professor Chiedo Nwankwo for organizing and convening and putting in extraordinary efforts to collect a distinguished group of speakers and commentators for this conference, in addition to her associate, Elor Nkere-Uwem, SAIS PhD candidate, and Giselle Povedano and other members of the SAIS team who have really helped to make this event a success. This is a timely and important gathering as we move into the early months of the new Biden-Harris administration and reflect on U.S. relations with this continent of 1.3 billion people across 54 countries. Without going into any detail or depth, it's important to note that the previous 4 years were really characterized in the U.S.-Africa relationship by inattention, sporadic engagement, and occasional hostility, particularly on issues such as immigration, security, and even race. And so in the new administration, we have an opportunity to engage on critical issues of economic growth, governance, and security. There have been decades of growth across the African continent since 2000. There are continued democratic aspirations and democratic struggles. There are troubling security challenges in such areas as the Horn of Africa and jihadist challenges in the Sahel. But nonetheless, the U.S. is well positioned to build on past relationships, to move quickly beyond previous limitations, and to chart a new era and a new period of engagement under the current administration. We have an excellent array of panels and discussants to take up these issues of governance, security, and economics. And at the outset, I'm delighted to introduce Dean Elliott Cohen of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, who has an extraordinarily broad and perceptive vantage on U.S. foreign policy. Dean Cohen, Elliott Cohen, is the Dean and Robert E. Osgood Professor at SAIS. He has been here since 1990, and he received his PhD and BA degrees from Harvard University, taught there and at the Naval War College. His books include The Big Stick, Conquered into Liberty, and Supreme Command. He was also a counselor in the Department of State from 2007 to 2009, and he has had senior roles in the Department of Defense. He is also a major commentator in the public square, especially, but not limited to, the Atlantic. He has been a leader, a colleague, and a friend for many years during my occupancy and role at SAIS, and I'm delighted to introduce Dean Cohen.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Let me thank you and Professor Nwankwo for putting together this conference. I really am delighted to be able to welcome everybody. I only wish I was doing it physically rather than virtually. But this is really a remarkable gathering. As Professor Lewis mentioned, I've had a bit of a firsthand look at American foreign policy as well as that of a scholar. And it has always struck me that Africa is sometimes the forgotten continent from the point of view of Washington, D.C. Not always. There's some bright spots, I think, in the administration which I served, the PEPFAR program. But it's basically true that American attention to Africa, despite all of its dynamism, its demographic growth, not just its potential, but its accomplishments, has been sporadic. And I think, therefore, the timing of this in a Biden administration, which will be thoughtful, which is not going to simply snap back to the policies of the past, but is going to take a fresh look. This is a particularly apt moment to do this. I also want to congratulate the organizers of the conference for the quite extraordinary reach. When I looked at the program, I was struck all the different themes that are being struck: democratization, economic growth, the impact of COVID, as well as security. And of course, the tremendous range of participants, most notably beginning with Vice President Osinbajo, who I'm delighted to welcome virtually to the school. It's, if I may say so, it's great to see a professor really rise right to the top of any country, but particularly one so important as Nigeria. And I'm not going to steal Professor Lewis's thunder as he introduces him, but we're very, very fortunate to have you with us, sir, and really want to extend a warm welcome. So with that, I'm just going to turn the floor back to you, Professor Lewis. Thank you for inviting me to be with you. Thank you all for being here. And I really look forward to an exciting and stimulating conference. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Elliot. Thanks, Dean Cohen, for those wonderful remarks and much needed perspective, as always, even just briefly. Indeed, PEPFAR and other initiatives are an important context for this conference, having framed significant initiatives in the relationship between the United States and the continent. It's now my great privilege to introduce His Excellency, Vice President Yemi Osinbajo of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I will, before proceeding with the details of the introduction, simply note that the Vice President will have access to questions in the Q&A window, and he has asked to select the questions himself, which we're grateful for. As a university professor and a legal scholar, he is no stranger to fielding all kinds of questions, sorting things through, and framing concise answers. And my goodness, as vice president, he must have refined those skills tremendously, being barraged on a daily basis with all kinds of issues and questions. But again, it's my privilege to introduce His Excellency Yemi Osinbajo, Federal Republic of Nigeria. He is now in the midst of his second term as vice president, and he has undertaken really remarkable and significant roles of economic management and statesmanship in Nigeria, Africa's most populous country and its largest economy. He is a figure known for his integrity, his dedication, and his effectiveness. So beyond some of the factual materials that we always include in an introduction of a dignitary, I also want to acknowledge his very significant and important and welcome role in Nigerian leadership. Thank you, Your Excellency. Oluyemi Osinbajo was born in 1957 in Lagos. He was educated at Igbobi College in Lagos, which is where I used to live right next to that in Yaba. He went to the University of Lagos, the Nigerian Law School, and the London School of Economics for legal and international affairs degrees. He is a senior advocate of Nigeria, and he was a professor of law until his inauguration as vice president in 2015. He has been a senior partner with Simmons Cooper Partners, a commercial law firm, and a leading global practice firm in Lagos. His career has spanned academia, public and private sectors. He has worked most closely with the All Progressives Congress from 2013, when he was tasked alongside other notable Nigerians to design and produce a manifesto for the new political party, which culminated in a roadmap to a new Nigeria. He joined President Muhammadu Buhari on the ticket in 2015 and was re-elected in 2019. He is married to Dolapo Ne Shoyode, a granddaughter of the sage Obafemi Awolowo, and the marriage is blessed with 3 children. And it is also finally and briefly worth noting, very importantly, that the vice president, prior to his inauguration, was the pastor in charge of the Lagos Province 48 Olive Tree Provincial Headquarters Parish in Ikoyi. So those are the facts. But once again, Excellency, it's wonderful to see you. We met previously at the Business Summit, the Lagos Economic Summit a couple of years ago. Circumstances prevent us from meeting in person, but we hope to welcome you to Washington sometime soon when conditions permit. It would be our great pleasure and honor. Delighted to welcome you to SAIS, to hear your reflections on conference proceedings. The floor is over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Lewis. Thank you, Professor Elliot Cohen, Professor Chiedu Nwankwo, all the distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to say a few words on the topic Africa-US Reengagement, a new foreign policy agenda, at this year's Johns Hopkins African Studies Program Conference. And I'd really like to thank the African Studies Program and Professor Chiedu Nwankwo in particular for this very kind invitation. The timing of this conversation is auspicious for a number of reasons. First, President Biden's speech in February to African leaders at the AU Summit signaled a new, more robust partnership, to quote him, in solidarity, support, and mutual respect. Second, at the top of the new administration's foreign policy agenda are 2 topics of crucial importance to African states: the COVID-19 pandemic, the fallouts, and what to do going forward, and climate change. Third, the positive signals from the US Congress. The chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, George Mix, in his first public statement called for a new Africa policy, which he said would be his top priority. And fourthly, and more broadly, perhaps is a view expressed by many who have given the matter some thought, that the 21st century will be the African century. In other words, for good or ill, the fate of Africa will impact on the rest of the world in this century because of its increasing share of humanity and because of its indispensable contribution to managing the global commons, be it to improve human security, to avert pandemics, or indeed to tackle the crisis caused by climate change. Let me expatiate a bit on this. It's estimated, for instance, that Africa will account for 25% of global population by 2050, up from about 17% today. So that's an 8% increase. Indeed, my own country, Nigeria, is projected to be the 3rd most populous country in the world by that date, by 2050, after India and China. If this increasing share of global population is reflected in economic productivity and increased material well-being, then it surely augurs well for the world. If, however, it brings about increased poverty and misery, then Africa could become a hotbed of restive youth that are vulnerable to the negative promptings of maniacal populists and religious radicals, and also for the other global concerns such as climate change. Distractions such as worsening poverty, violent extremism, dysfunctional governments can only worsen matters. So I think that a resetting of US foreign policy agenda with Africa should promote a partnership that brings about economic prosperity, increases security, combats disease, improves governance, and mitigates the effects of climate change. Africa is in many ways, and I'm sure that most will agree, the last frontier for economic development. And it has the potential to be a global growth pole. Indeed, as other parts of the world are looking inwards, Africa is moving confidently to integrate its economies through the Africa Union Agenda 2063, as well as the recent establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements. As Asian countries move to produce more sophisticated goods and services, and of course, as labor becomes more expensive there, Africa has a good chance to become the factory of the world. This would require investments in machinery, skills, and technologies to improve productivity and increase returns. So I think the US is well placed to lead trade and investment ties with Africa. And it already has a good leg in with the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA. This legislation, AGOA, removed all tariffs on 6,400 products available for export to the US. And it saw some African countries, a few though, benefiting considerably. South Africa's auto exports to the US under AGOA have created thousands of jobs in that country and in the auto supply value chain in several neighboring countries. Export of garments from other countries such as Ethiopia, Mauritius, Lesotho, Eswatini, and Kenya have also created a large number of jobs. But AGOA's challenge, aside from the fact that only a small number of African countries have actually benefited, are also the changing dynamics of trade within Africa since AGOA was passed 20 years ago. So for example, the EU, the European Union, has signed several EPAs with several countries, several African countries, which have implications for tariff disparities that may need to be reviewed in order to create a more level playing field. Also, the African Continental Free Trade Agreements are set to kick in, and AGOA must now be implemented consistent with the AfCFTA. AGOA expires in 2025, but I believe that a new and improved AGOA that takes these challenges into account can be negotiated well ahead of 2025. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the need to coordinate actions to prevent and tackle pandemics, while also building up public health infrastructure in developed and developing countries alike. The reality, however, is that Africa still bears a disproportionate burden of communicable diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, meningitis, to mention a few. The US has helped to improve healthcare outcomes in Africa, including through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. And I think that same spirit of collaboration with regard to making COVID-19 vaccines available to African countries is now called for. This is not a time for vaccine nationalism and export bans, which we've seen here and there, but it's a time for working together towards universal vaccination against the disease. And I believe the US can lead in that effort to ensure that all countries and their peoples can access vaccines irrespective of the resources available to them. And quite frankly, already some support, we've seen quite a bit of support. The US has rejoined COVAX, of course, rejoined the WHO. All of this has been very helpful in creating at least the right environment for more cooperation towards increasing vaccine availability and solving some of the problems associated with the difficulty in getting vaccines today. To leave that and go to conflicts. All too often, I think people outside the continent, outside the African continent, tend to see Africa as a conflict-ridden continent beset by insurgencies and wild-eyed terrorists. There has undoubtedly been increased restiveness in certain parts of Africa, which is driven or aided by poverty, alienation, environmental degradation, and poor governance. In truth, though, the troubles in the main are due to an encroachment of globally known terror groups or their franchises in different parts of Africa. The US has had counterterrorism presence in Africa, in about 15 African countries, in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa in particular, combating jihadist terrorist groups who operate largely in the Sahel, especially the sub-Saharan Sahel region and the areas further southwest around the Lake Chad, Nigeria, especially northern Nigeria, Somalia, and also Mozambique. The US Africa Command, Africom, has been, of course, a very active force in all of the activities of the US in this region. So while it is evident that the threat of violent extremist organizations is growing, it's very clear that that threat is growing, it will appear that US policy has since 2020 shifted from a strategy of degrading violent extremist organizations in West Africa in particular to simply containing their spread. But the escalation of the attacks and the synergies being created amongst these extremist groups calls for a review of that provision, of that position. I think that that provision of containment, needs to be reviewed. It may be the moment for a more robust intervention along the lines of US-backed operations in clearing terrorists and insurgents in the Middle East. I think that we have a moment now where, just on account of the escalation of insurgencies, especially in the West African region, of course, the Sahel, for a more robust US intervention. I think this is something that US foreign policy, along with African partners, may wish to take a second look at. A key tenet of US foreign policy has been to uphold the values and principles such as democracy, human rights, rule of law, and public accountability. These issues resonate very strongly with ordinary Africans who believe that improved governance is crucial in ensuring that their votes count, that their rights are protected, and that state resources are used for the common good. And United States engagement with Africa, I think, should naturally take these matters on board. However, I must say that it should not take the shape of finger wagging, but rather a balanced and joint endeavor to achieve these objectives. To paraphrase President Biden, one that is based on mutual respect. Whatever the case, there should be no rush to judgment, but an effort to hear the other side. And I think we should create more opportunities to hear the other side, not through lobbying firms and that sort of thing, but more direct governmental types of meetings and interactions that enable both governments better understand what their points of view are. And I think we have a perfect opportunity for doing so now. This does not imply, in my view, turning a blind eye to gross infractions of international law and human rights, but it does require, in my view, a broader and more nuanced perspective of issues as well as an understanding of local dynamics before taking a stand. As I had said earlier, climate change, including the risk of a perfect storm of population pressure, environmental degradation, and pandemics, pose a serious threat to African development in particular and the world in general. It seems to me that the United States and Africa must then work together to tackle climate change and moderate global warming, including through an energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies. African countries have already made commitments in this regard towards implementing the Paris Climate Change Agreement targets, and we all have our targets, our NDCs, and we're working hard towards achieving them. However, the commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 has led to a growing trend amongst development finance institutions to withdraw from fossil fuel investments, including the World Bank's decision to cease funding for upstream oil and gas development, and the new restrictions on financing downstream gas developments, which is currently being considered and in fact being implemented by some European Union countries. The United Kingdom and the US have also been considering these defunding of gas projects. While these may be well-intentioned, I think that this move does not take into account the principles of common but differentiated responsibility and leaving no one behind, which are enshrined in the global treaties around sustainable development and climate action. These are principles that we all agree to. These are principles that we all accept, a shared responsibility, leaving no one behind. I think that the move to defund gas projects disregards the importance of gas as a means to urgently address energy poverty in a technologically and economically viable manner. And furthermore, increasing the use of gas, which of course is a cleaner fossil fuel, in power generation gives African countries the opportunity to phase out more polluting fuels such as coal, diesel, and heavy fuel oil, while bringing on board more renewables. I think the US should lend its weight to stopping this manifestly unfair trend that can undermine the sense of collective responsibility we all have towards mitigating climate change. What is required is a just transition to zero emissions, and that expression is becoming increasingly popular. One where, in our view, the developed economies meet the commitments made at COP15 in Copenhagen of $100 billion yearly to assist developing economies to transit to zero emissions. US-Africa relations need not be unidimensional, and the United States, of course, is an acknowledged global leader in economic and military terms, as well as through its contributions to the norms that shape the global order. So I think that the US could work with Africa, either under the auspices of the Africa Union, or indeed through individual countries like Nigeria, to build a better world. Africa should not be seen or used as a pawn in the great power games, nor as an arena in the contest to secure strategic minerals and natural resources, but rather as a partner in building a more secure, a more peaceful and prosperous world. Indeed, rather than view every interaction with Africa from a competitive lens, I think that the US can work with other countries to support Africa in its efforts to meet our infrastructural needs. Infrastructure in the form of power stations, ports, rail networks, roads, will spur growth and reduce the time and cost of doing business. The fiscal constraints of African countries means that there is a scope for private capital to fund, operate, and own some of these things. So given their technical know-how and financial resources, US companies should engage or could engage in the provision of infrastructure in Africa. And we do expect that the US International Development Finance Corporation may support some of these efforts. So cooperation and partnerships rather than competition with other global actors, I believe, can complement these efforts. And I also think that the US could work with partners, including the G20, to establish an international economic system that works for Africa and other developing countries. It's a very encouraging sign in this regard that the US has signaled support for the $650 billion increase in special drawing rights at the IMF, which will go a long way in providing much liquidity in African countries, given the fiscal constraints caused by last year's economic downturn. Similarly, the recent initiative of the US to ensure that businesses are taxed where they make their sales is a major step forward in bringing about a fairer international tax regime. To be effective, however, it should apply not just to a few multinational companies, but should be truly global in nature. Otherwise, African countries may be excluded from getting their fair share such taxes. I think I'll just stop here so that I can take a few questions before my time completely runs out. So thank you all very much for listening, and I'll be prepared to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Your Excellency, Professor Osinbajo, for that just stunning remarks. The depth and breadth of it just really, addresses the themes that the conference seeks to, engage with today. And I want to say that you have set the tone beautifully for this conference going forward. And indeed, we are grateful. The engagement or approach should not take the shape of finger wagging, right? But a balanced approach to this new partnership. Neither should Africa be seen as a pawn in the power game, right? I am sure that these nuggets and a whole lot of it which is provided here would provide quite some rich material for the panelists going forward. And so we have quite a number of questions here, and perhaps let's just start with Michelle Lee, who asks, how can we assure that benefits from economic growth and industrialization in Africa does not exacerbate current high rates of inequality across the continent?
Yes. Okay. Do I answer them one at a time or take a bunch of them?
So do you, it depends on you, Your Excellency, what you want to do.
I think it will help if I had maybe 3 or so,
Sure.
just so in case they're overlapping.
Definitely. All right. So, and then let's take another one, this one from Ayoboni Akindoli. And she asks, what is the Nigerian government's perspective of the global energy transition, its influence on financing from US development financing institutions, and the possibility that this is leading to a slowdown in closing the energy deficit, as these strategies may exclude fossil fuels and gas, which are able to provide critical base load generation capacity at scale. And then maybe let's take another one. Underpinning low economic performance of several African nations is inability to capture linkages in value chain addition pipeline of African mineral resources. Can you please speak to coordinated efforts by the Nigerian government towards knowledge transfer to local manufacturing industries to spur economic growth?
Yeah. Could you just repeat that? I didn't quite get that last question.
Right. And so Ruben Umunna asks, underpinning low economic performance of several African nations is inability to capture linkages in value chain addition pipeline of African mineral resources. Can you please speak to coordinated efforts by the Nigerian government towards knowledge transfer to local manufacturing industries to spur economic growth? And then maybe let's just add one more. Akindoli asks, any thoughts on if and how the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is designed to ensure improved outcomes for Nigeria and other African countries, rather than making it easier for the rest of the world to sell to a region without local gains in productivity being retained?
Okay. Could you repeat the last one?
Right.
The last question. Just repeat the question.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. Any thoughts on how and if the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is designed to ensure improved outcomes for Nigeria and other African countries, rather than making it easier for the rest of the world to sell to the region without local gains in productivity being retained?
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, I think I have all of those questions in
Yes.
now. And get them all. Okay. Beginning with how do we ensure that the benefits from economic growth and industrialization in Africa do not exacerbate current inequalities? I think first, the whole point of economic growth and what we've tried to emphasize, especially in our recent economic sustainability plan, is ensuring that economic growth leads to job creation. You know, there is that whole issue of jobless growth, and this we've seen, especially for resource-rich countries like ours, where, you know, I mean, for instance, we know that oil production, oil sales, and all of that do not necessarily translate to jobs, yet that would translate to growth. If you look at the growth figures, when oil prices are high, growth figures will go up as well, without necessarily translating to jobs. So our emphasis now, as part of diversifying our economy, is a focus on ensuring that economic growth actually means job creation. And because that is our emphasis in the economic sustainability plan, and that we spread across so many different things, we spread it across the policies on agriculture, especially our new agricultural imperative under the economic sustainability plan. We spread it across our expansion in the use of solar power. We're doing 5 million new solar power connections. As of course, this is all private sector driven, with funding from government and also some funding from the World Bank. All of this we expect will create jobs, create new opportunities. The same with housing program, which is also, you know, we're doing 300,000 social housing and all of that. Now, all of these are to create employment, and also to ensure that there is some, you know, that we're able to mitigate inequities and inequalities in whatever way. I think also our social protection program, which is the largest of its sort in sub-Saharan Africa, and in some components even in Africa. That social protection program is of course designed to ensure that the benefits of economic growth reach the most vulnerable as well. You know, and so without elaborating too much about the social investment program, we may not be able to get on to the other questions. But these are the ways by which we hope to mitigate the possibilities of inequality. And I can speak, of course, for Nigeria, not for the whole of Africa. I think the other question that's been asked is, what is Nigeria's the global energy transition, its influence of financing from the US and all of that? I made that point maybe in part earlier, which is that the developing countries, the EU, the US, and some of the development finance institutions have more or less taken the position that the process of arriving at zero emissions by 2050 must involve the defunding of oil and gas projects, and in particular gas projects. Of course, you know, this creates great difficulties for countries such as ours and many other African countries that are oil and gas rich. And so this is the reason why we're emphasizing the whole idea of a just transition, that it is clearly unfair to have a situation where a continent. Africa, of course, is the least polluting continent, and yet possibly expected to bear what may be an unjust burden relative to its contribution to pollution. And we also think that, just to the point that you made, renewable energies were, of course, doing a tremendous amount of work. I just mentioned what we're doing in solar and off-grid renewables as well, several other renewable projects that we're doing. But it's also true that in order to attain the critical base load for generation, especially for powering industrial plants and industries generally, we're yet to arrive at a point where renewable energies are able to meet that challenge as adequately as we expect. So for African countries, for developing countries, we definitely need the base load, which means that we should still be able to use fossil fuels. And we think that the use of oil and gas, especially gas, is certainly cleaner fuel. And in the process of that transition to zero emissions and to no fossil fuels, we should be encouraged in the use of gas in particular, because this is cleaner fuel, and there's no reason at all why the oil gas project should be defunded, because that would, of course, mean tremendous difficulty for achieving any of our targets against energy poverty and all that. I think there's also a question on AfCFTA, how we think that might improve outcomes. I think I was also asked by Ayoboni how we might increase, how we might ensure that the AfCFTA has improved outcomes or leads to improved outcomes for Nigeria and other African countries, itself making it just easier for the rest of the world to sell. Now, the negotiations that are going on at the moment are important in that respect. We are at the point where we are negotiating some of the trade, in negotiating the trade agreements. We're at the point where we are trying to ensure that the trading conditions are right. So for example, just there are certain areas where we insist that we cannot simply open up, right? And we're also trying to prevent a situation where dumping takes place and all that. So for example, if a neighboring African country were to open up itself to some other industrialized company coming just to set up factories there, just for purposes of being able to import cheap products into Nigeria, the negotiations that are going on are to prevent those sorts of situations where more developed economies can simply take up, can simply come to an African country, start producing and selling and dumping products, and in the name of open borders and the AfCFTA. So the current negotiations that are going on are very important in that respect. So the transshipment rules are rules that we're looking at very closely now to ensure that we do not have a situation where the short end of the AfCFTA. And these are some of the negotiations that are going on currently. So this is really a critical stage in the implementation of the AfCFTA, especially as we're looking at several of the rules, the trading rules. Thank you. I think those are the questions that have been asked. Have I left out something?
Your Excellency, we also came up to time, and you have done justice to the questions, and we are so grateful to have you. Thank you so very much for joining us, and we wish you the very best as you continue to grapple with the myriad issues that your administration is grappling with, and as you continue to model really, what leadership, effective, efficient, transparent, and accountable leadership should be. We wish you the very best, and we look forward to having you back with us next time in person. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Edo. Thank you. And thank you all very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
And so at this time, we will be moving straight ahead to our first panel of the day, which is the U.S. Strategic Partnership for a Secure and Stable Africa. And to moderate this panel is Elo Nkeruwem, who is finishing up a PhD in International Relations, African Studies concentration at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Washington, D.C. Her dissertation focuses on discourse and political violence. It proposes a renewed focus on the narratives that contribute to the emergence of extremist violence. Before coming to SAIS, she graduated from the University of London, London School of Economics and Political Science, with a degree in International Relations. In 2013, she obtained a Master of Letters degree in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, where her dissertation, which analyzed the interaction between the news media and the Nigerian terrorist group Boko Haram, earned her the Sir Menzies Campbell Prize for Best Dissertation in International Relations. She's an award-winning investigative journalist and has recently finished an advocacy fellowship with Transparency International Defense and Security, Washington, D.C. Nice to have you with us, Elo. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Nwankwo, and good morning. May I invite my panelists to please turn on their videos, Ambassador Haile Menkeros and Ambassador Andrew Young. Good morning, Ambassador. Good morning, ambassadors, I should say.
Good morning, great to see you.
Good morning.
And so I'd like to start, of course, and it had to be my panel, to start with a logistical issue. Unfortunately, our third panelist will not be joining us today. She has a family emergency this morning and is actually in hospital. So we wish her and her family member well. So I'm stuck with these two ambassadors, and I hope that we can have a good conversation this morning. So let me start by just saying good morning and good afternoon if you're joining us from the US. Good morning. And thank you for sparing some time from your morning to be with us today. And if you are joining us from the continent or from Europe, would like to say good afternoon and thank you for joining us today. So the first panel that I'm privileged to moderate has been titled US-Africa Strategic Partnerships for a Secure and Stable Africa. And the panelists on this platform will interrogate the strategic partnerships between the United States and African countries. And my first caveat that I want to start with this morning is to address the problematic headline, which goes against our better instinct of flattening African states into a single entity. I want to say and emphasize that this is not what we are doing. We acknowledge that African states and indeed African regions have unique foreign policy preferences and challenges. And this headline merely serves the purpose of brevity. And to quickly to go over conflict trends on the continent. Conflict trends on the continent in the past decade have informed what appears to be a narrower focus on conflict types that involve non-state actors. So we take example from the Horn of Africa and look at groups from Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. We also take example from West Africa and the Sahel region, West African Sahel in particular, with IS and AQ affiliated groups. When we move beyond that, we look at the very nature of violent extremism and the pervasiveness of extremism, the persistence and the rapid spread through the Sahel. And we've come to see why, and there may be a justification for this academic and maybe policy focus on, these issues. And we understand, for example, that, the securitization of the US foreign policy, especially with regard to the continent, has been because of, these sort of issues and the emergence of non-state groups and extremism that has spread so widely. But this new disturbing trends, or perhaps we've also seen the resuscitation of latent conflict. Latent conflicts in East Africa. We've seen the growth of interstate tensions. We've seen with potential for wide-reaching violent outcomes. And those are really, really disturbing because we can perceive and anticipate the possibilities of extreme destabilization in not just sub-Saharan Africa, but in Northern Africa as well. And so more than anything else, we can agree here that Africa does not need more conflict, especially not in some of the continent's biggest economies. And the situation with Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan over the proposed Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam needs to be taken in hand and de-escalated as quickly as possible, as with the tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia in the Tigray region. Within the past 2 years, we can also review and see these disturbing changes, growing extremism activities in Mozambique and Burkina Faso, new or renewed tensions between state forces and rebel groups in Mali and Chad. Ambassador Young, you will bear witness that just over the weekend, the State Department has withdrawn non-essential workers from Chad. And it appears that Africa's security challenges are unending. The question is, how can strategic partnerships between the United States and African countries or regions help to curb or to manage these situations? We're discussing this within the context of the new administration and the opportunity that this presents for a reset. So let me quickly introduce my panelists and then we can jump right into today's discussion. Today we are privileged to have with us Ambassador Haile Menkeres. Ambassador Menkeres' prestigious diplomatic career has seen him serve in multiple capacities, including as Eritrean ambassador to Ethiopia, UN Special Representative to the African Union, and the head of the UN office to the AU, and finally as the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. He now serves as a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Kenya. I'd like to welcome you, sir, to our meeting. We also have with us, privileged to have with us Ambassador Andrew Young. He has recently assumed duties as the Deputy to the Commander for Civil Military Engagement with the United States Africa Command. He has previously served as US Ambassador to Burkina Faso and as the Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Bamako, Mali. I would like to mention that Ambassador Young is a SAIS graduate, so welcome back to SAIS, sir. And unfortunately, Ms. Idayat Hassan will not be joining us, so let me go ahead and reroute the question that I had initially planned to start with Idayat. I had wanted to ask the question that focuses on human security on the continent and questions about how we can frame security needs that focus on human security and how we can place community level solutions at the heart of US-Africa partnerships. What the current situation is and what the tangible ways that we can use to improve these current conditions. So maybe Ambassador Menkeres, if you could start and see if you could articulate the problems of human security on the continent, try to situate that in how in US-Africa strategic partnerships. And after that, Ambassador Young, I hope you can quickly jump in there and respond to what he says. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, let me come in there quickly. Before we answer that question, I know you have prepared opening remarks. Do you want to start with your opening remarks? And let's maybe start with a very general question. Since Hidayat is not here, maybe we can I can give you 10 minutes. I can put you both on the spot and expand the number of time I had initially planned for the both of you. So let's start with your opening remarks, and then we can jump right into discussing the human security situation. Thank you.
So I go first, or Ambassador Vinqueros?
Since you offered to go first, I can let you go first.
Great. Well, thank you, Alor, and it's a pleasure to join Ambassador Vinqueros on this panel. And I send our solidarity with Hidayat as she addresses these issues. It's really a pleasure, as you said, to rejoin the SAIS African Studies family. I'm a beneficiary of this program, and it's led to an exciting and rewarding career we tackle with many of the questions, the challenging questions that you outlined and as you set up this panel. And this panel is super timely in terms of the opportunity to re-engage with the U.S. administration as the U.S. administration focuses on setting the stage for their tenure. You know, I just joined this a little bit late. I didn't get the earlier part because I was in a conversation with the Commander Townsend of Africom, and he is engaging with members of Congress. And broadly speaking, there is a great wealth and depth of support for U.S. engagement in Africa. That's deepening and widening, and I think that gives us a cause for optimism. Here, what is my job as the deputy to the commander for civil military engagement? You know, United States military has combatant commands covering the globe, but Africom was designed differently. They put a civilian as a deputy to the command, and I think that's reinforced in the whole effort that our engagement in the Africa is through partnerships. Our engagement is through a whole of government effort with diplomacy, development, and defense, you know, working in synergy to advance our common interests. And so I'd like to hit a couple of really brief topics, and then, as Elor said, leave a lot of time for interaction, because I think that's the most effective way for us to get after the problem set. I'm just so pleased, though, to support the students and leaders at SAIS's Africa Studies program. You're embarking on, I think, an exciting career ahead of you, and I think there are a lot of possibilities as we get after these problems. So what have I been doing lately as the deputy to the commander for civil military engagement? The broad theme is fully consistent with the leadership of the Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin, who are focused on having defense and development and diplomacy work together. So my first interactions as deputy to the commander was to lead a delegation to Sudan to help that country and the Sudanese people who have taken the very bold, brave step to put in the past the dictatorship of Omar Bashir, and to chart a new path, to put behind them the association with as a state sponsor of terror and chart a new path. And so my goal was to lead a delegation of military officials and myself to reinforce that civilian-led transition to democratic governance. That's what our goal was in that effort, to show a better opportunity for the Sudanese people as they move forward towards a political structure that reinforces the voice of all members. I next led a delegation to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, a country that is struggling through a challenging transition, putting beside the lack of participation in human rights violations of the past, and to move forward towards a more participatory and inclusive government. There I focused, again, with military officers in tandem with me to help speak on behalf of the United States, to engage with members of civil society, to engage with the civilian leadership as we tried to support that transition. And then the most recent trip I led was part of an Africom delegation with myself as a diplomat, a flag officer from the Africom, and our senior development advisor. To do what? To reinforce that historic transition in Niger from between the first democratic elected presidents in the history of that country. All those efforts, I think, are combined as part of our desire to reinforce the themes that are attacked in your seminar today, which is re-engaging the government, re-engaging in a values-based support for political transitions towards civilian-led strengthened democracy in the African continent. I'm not going to talk too long, but I wanted to wrap up with a couple of things and then turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Ambassador Minqueiros, to just lay out a couple of quick things. You know, what is U.S. Africom's mission? You know, we're working to assist African states and regional organizations, you know, to strengthen their defensive capabilities, to better enable our African partners to address their security threats, reduce threats to the U.S., and to promote prosperity and stability. So advancing prosperity and stability in Africa is a U.S. national interest. And that's how we're seeking to advance our mission. We have a motto. Our motto is by, with, and through. That's how we try to advance our common interests. We're seeking to enhance the capabilities of our partners in ways that are cost-effective, impactful, and responsive to protections of civilian rights, human rights, and good governance. You know, look, as Elora mentioned, there's a lot of challenges on the African continent, a lot of instability that we're addressing today. And in fact, as Elora mentioned, we've just been working on the evacuation of some of our dependents out of N'Djamena. And in my last 7 years, I've actually had to evacuate 2 embassies multiple times. So it's not my, you know, I'm not going to take the blame for that. But we do have these challenges with instability. But broadly speaking, I think that I see a lot of hope in the young people we work with, in the structures we're trying to reinforce. And although the road ahead may be difficult, I think we're seeking to go a long way together. And that's when we do so together in tandem with our partners towards a common goal of a secure and prosperous African partners. So that's what I wanted to say to get started. Turn it over to Ambassador Minqueiros. And then what I would look forward to is that interaction with that excellent team of members of the SAIS African Affairs community. Back over to you, Elora, and looking forward to the next phase of this conversation.
Thank you, Ambassador Young, for your summary of U.S., especially African activities on the continent. I hope we can, as the course of the conference goes on, where I would like to engage you more substantively on the details of those, you know, those African ideas and ideals and intentions, especially with regard to actual measurable security assistance and other ways that the U.S. government, through its various agencies, is involved on the continent in strategic sense. So thank you for that, and I'll hand over to Ambassador Minqueiros.
Thank you very much. First, let me start by thanking actually those who invited me to participate in this very important and timely topic of re-engagement with the U.S. government, between Africa and the U.S., the new U.S. administration. Let me start by saying that there is, first and foremost, a need for a firm U.S. policy shift towards global cooperation and multilateralism, a necessary condition for Africa to have confidence in the U.S. that can be a reliable partner and ally. There has been a move in almost all the economically developed countries in the last decades towards nationalism, with many, including in Africa, seeing this as the underlying reason for the US America first policy of the Trump era, Brexit in the UK, etc. I think it is important to assess what brought about the shift, that whether those conditions and whether those conditions have now changed or will change to increase confidence that the necessary shift in the US towards global cooperation and thus cooperation with Africa will be firmly reestablished. President Biden has expressed his intention for such a change, and Africa welcomes it and awaits to see it clearly defined and established. This is my first point. The second, cooperation in the area of peace and security in Africa has to be defined, spelled out in a way that highlights mutual benefit rather than one directional, that is America assisting Africa. That done, cooperation needs to be based on complementarity and comparative advantage. In the area of facing threats to peace and security, Africa has the manpower. What it needs is enhanced technical and operational capacity, as Ambassador Young was mentioning, actually, which the US Africa Command has been doing and hopefully will continue to do in a much wider scale. A secure Africa provides security for trade, free competition in a currently rather hostile world, and security for the US itself, as well as it would prevent the rise and expansion of terrorism and violent extremism that would pose a direct threat to the US itself as well. And third point, Africa would like to see a US ally that would work with African states and institutions to encourage international institutions such as the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and indeed the World Health Organization, as recently, the need of which was recently demonstrated, to cooperate with Africa. The UN in particular, with its powerful Security Council, can be encouraged by the US, which is a key member, to partner with the African Union, with the regional economic commissions, with groups of African states collaborating to face common security threats such as the G5 Sahel, and individual countries facing daunting security threats as well. Through US encouragement in the past, the UN Security Council did start such collaboration with the African Union Peace and Security Council. Such cooperation, however, needs to develop into a more reliable and sustainable partnership. One key issue has been on the agenda and raised by the AU, but not yet agreed to by the UN Security Council, is the reliable financing of Africa-led UN Security Council approved, of course, peace enforcement and peacekeeping operations such as AMISOM in Somalia. Such cooperation, once agreed, can be extended to the regional economic commissions as well. My fourth point, the main cause of violent conflict in Africa, as elsewhere, and the lack of stability in the continent, is the lack of proper political, economic, and social governance. US partnership in strengthening African capacity to address these challenges, such as providing better educational opportunities, job creation, building technical capacity, including through extension services, the development and strengthening of public institutions, etc., is another huge area that helps to enhance capacity for conflict management and prevention of violent conflict. And Africa would definitely like the US to have a firm policy of assisting partnering with Africa in these areas. Number 5, increase in US investment in African economies, not only in the extractive industries, but also, as has been the case so far, but also in manufacturing, would also help in the development of Africa's economy and the extension of employment opportunities, thus mitigating the causes of violent conflict and instability overall, as would opening up the US market for African products, as the Vice President of Nigeria mentioned in his introductory statement. I will leave this, of course, to be expanded in the other appropriate on cooperation, on economic cooperation, but needed to emphasize its role in preventing conflict, enhancing stability as well. And lastly, there is need to articulate what the US expects from Africa in exchange. As I mentioned at the start, the relationship has to be a partnership for mutual benefit if it is to be sustained. When entering into such a clear relationship, Africa would indeed be a reliable partner with the US, enhancing global security, free trade, and continued economic development through free competition, the protection of human rights, and the resolution of common challenges that face us all as humanity. Let me stop here as an opening, rather general statement, and would be more than glad to participate in the discussions with your guidance.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was a very strong statement, and thank you for throwing the challenge and forcing us to think, very quickly about these issues. I would say that your message today emphasizes the need for a stable, reliable interaction between these two countries, or the two continents, so between the US and African countries. And in particular, I'm really thankful that you brought up the idea, the issues of the political and economic and social governance on the continent, and the need to strengthen capacity in that regard as a way to mitigate conflict and, perpetual conflict on the continent. So one way we can move forward from this very strong statement that you made and strong emphasis on pertinent issues that we should discuss today is to maybe just move forward very quickly and discuss, that institutional partnership that you are speaking about. And the question that we initially had to speak about this, and we will return to the community focused security policy making that I wanted to bring up as a first agenda, but let's jump right into institutional partnership. The question we have is, what opportunities exist for US-Africa strategic partnerships, especially within a multilateral arrangement, which Ambassador Menkeres has brought up, the UN at the high level engagement, and how the UN, the United States can step in, especially through its position in the UN Security Council. How can we address the need of the African Union in a way that centers the preeminence of the African Union, just as Ambassador Menkeres mentioned, in a way that allows the AU to perform at its best and also respects the sovereignty of individual states? I want to mention that the Vice President had earlier talked about the need to have a situation of cooperation rather than of competition. When we speak about US involvement on the continent, we immediately start to talk about great power politics and talk about the behaviors of other external partners. But to ask the question, how can we harness a cooperative space and rather than harp on the competitive space? Would you want to set the tone for that conversation, Ambassador Menkeres, and then Ambassador Young can respond adequately?
Thank you very much. The African Union as a continental organization has really been very effective in articulating Africa's needs and Africa's challenges, perhaps not so much so in taking measures with capacity to address them fully, that in fact, the RECs, the Regional Economic Commissions, have been much more effective, in fact, being closer to where those problems and issues are more visible and more tangibly felt by the member states in that region. In fact, the tendency has been the African Union starting actually overall approaches, and then the regional economic commissions becoming more concrete, and even some countries that face a certain problem, like the G5 Sahel, getting together ad hocly to address this threat that faces all of them more effectively, because they have more greater knowledge of the sources and manifestations of those problems. The whole problem in effectiveness has been majorly lack of adequate capacity. The African Union, for example, let me start with the greater one, has consistently sought a more reliable, consistent partnership with the UN Security Council. And still the UN Security Council has started actually this partnership with the AU, but it is not sort of recognizing equality. Of course, it is not equal. This is continental, that is global. But when it comes to issues about the continent itself, definitely the African Union must be taken as a partner and not necessarily just as a junior through which actually to implement decisions of the UN Security Council alone. And therefore, they have been discussing, members of the UN Security Council with the Peace and Security Council. And you can understand what that means also. What the AU has been doing is, look, we do have greater knowledge of the sources and the actors in these conflicts. And we do have the manpower. I mean, these are Africans, actually. They don't have better capacity than the rest, those who want to work for. What we lack is capacity, training, the provision of technical assistance also, in terms of arms, in terms of machinery, for example, surveillance and all that. That is what we need, but we need this on a sustainable basis and not necessarily each time there is a conflict sort of asking and getting not adequate. And this is at the crux of the discussion that's going on. I think the UN, the US could help very much. The same thing in all the other regional organizations also. And indeed, individual countries either coming together or individually facing them. This is what they lack, and not an army coming from outside actually to fight Africa's wars. We have more than enough personnel.
Okay, just to take from there, thank you, sir, for that. Ambassador Yo, we understand US security and military assistance usually refrained and restrained by considerations of human rights abuses, which sometimes explains why US is unwilling to support militaries on the continent or even at the AU level. Can you articulate what, going forward, what you think is sustainable, as Ambassador Menkeros is emphasizing? Is there a hope for a straight and a predictable and sustainable support from the US? And can you tell me the details of what those assistanceships could look like in a substantive way that doesn't just speak to issues of good governance with no real substance to the policies?
Thank you very much, Elor. And I just wanted to reinforce how appreciative I am of Ambassador Menkeros' framing of so many of these questions. I think that kind of running through some of the great thoughts that he raised. You know, this administration is all about renewing alliances and renewing partnerships. And we're looking at that on the African continent. I have a lot of experience in the Sahel, but just to speak specifically to your question and his reference to our relationships with the African Union, we have a fabulous ambassador in the African Union, Ambassador Jessie Le Pen. We have a fabulous ambassador and permanent representative at the UN, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. She has, respecting the point that has been brought up earlier about the collective security, the collective institution of the African Union and the individual member states. You know, we have engagements with at the UN with member states of the Security Council, and then we have engagements in Nairobi with the African Union leadership. And I think that we're looking to strengthen those partnerships. I know more specifically the investments that we've made, and you're talking about specifics, Allure, on institutions of the region to advance their security capabilities. And the point that the Ambassador Nkiras talked about in terms of capacity gaps. So let's talk about the G5 Sahel. There's an institution that is born from the region, right? It's the region saying we have a collective security challenge. Let us band together our resources and our capabilities to get after this problem. The US invests substantially into the member states of the G5 Sahel. So this institution can be more effective, and we can share our training and capabilities with them so they can be more effective. Always respective, though, of your point, Allure, that we want to work with partners who are respectful of human rights, who don't make the problem worse by uninvestigated human rights violations. So that's essential, we think, to getting after the end state of a problem. You know, if, one of the axioms we've had here at the command is, you know, if the security forces are well respected by the populations and the populations run towards the security forces in the face of trouble, that's the sort of security force we want to partner with. If, on the other hand, the security forces are deemed extractive or abusive, well, that's not the type of partner that we want to engage with. You know, I want to jump very slightly to this point about the issues that what the United States might expect from African partners, and the points that Ambassador Nkiras rose, which I think were spot on. We have in the US law prohibitions on training forces that have committed gross human rights violations. We're not going to do that. It's not good for our values, and it's not good for the success of the program. We have similar laws on corrupt practices in business, right? So what is it? You know, we have what's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So if a US company bribes a African company to secure a contract to build a road, the United States government will prosecute that, that US business leader. Those are parallel institutions. So what do we expect from, I think, our African partners as we move forward is a commitment to when there are credible allegations of abuse that are diverting public resources into the pockets of someone and away from the intended purpose, that those are investigated and folks are held accountable. But let me just hit very, very briefly those fabulous points that Ambassador Nkiras talked about. We want to help African partners be security exporters. I saw that a lot when I was in Burkina Faso in the early stages of my tenure there. Burkina has been a longtime contributor to United Nations peacekeeping operations. Other countries on the region, particularly an issue we're dealing with a lot right now in Somalia, we work with partners, both from the broader institution, Amazon, and also bilaterally to help get after the insecurity that the Somali public suffers from. Institutions like you talked about, the developing host nations capacity, and Ambassador Nkiras in his third point mentioned the WHO and other types of institutions that get after the things that really touch our African friends most directly. You know, the United States invested, when I was in Burkina Faso, in developing their own health surveillance network. So we do the training, we fund the building, but who is doing the work? It's those African partners who have done, who have that, as Ambassador Minqueiros noted, the local knowledge. And so I think that that enabling approach that the U.S. Has towards engagement on the African continent is one of partnership and building on the respective comparative advantages, which I think is fully consistent with what Ambassador Minqueiros' points were. You know, you talk about helping on the economic side as well. You know, we have had, and Ambassador Minqueiros mentioned extension services. Michigan State University has partnerships that have lasted on the African continent for 30 years. They've built ability to address some global climate change, to help farmers. There's this Purdue bag. I don't know if you've seen this in West Africa, which is University of Purdue helped build this bag so that Nebbia bean farmers can store their products over a 2-year period, and therefore they're not selling everything at the bulk of the harvest arrival. They can spread out the sales of their production, and thereby have a better yield and a better, more stable revenue collection over the source of their productivity. That's the sort of enabling investments that are the watchword of our attempts. And on the economic side, you know, in Ghana we've done some investments in manufacturing, particularly in the transforming in the cocoa sector, a big jobs provider in Africa. One of the ways we do these investments is through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a partnership where, together with economists from the host nation, we develop an assessment of what are the impediments to long-term economic growth. What would if we wanted to inject a large sum of money, you know, in the $350, $400 million range, that would really have a sustainable impact on improving the quality of life of our African partners? What would that thing be, and how would we implement it? We do all that together with the African partners. So those are the sorts of ways that I think get after the points that Ambassador Minqueiros so aptly said. And then let me just wrap up with one other thing about community engagement and community development. You're looking for the practical examples of what we're doing to get after that. So in Mali, we worked through an organization of U.S. Agency for International Development called the Office of Transition Initiative. And with a little bit of organizational know-how and engagement, we helped civil society organizations speak more effectively and share their voice as the government, to help the government understand what their needs were and to help make better decisions. When the security environment got tougher and we couldn't send U.S. Peace Corps volunteers into certain parts of the country, what did we do? We helped enable African beneficiaries and graduates of the Young African Leaders Initiative to go into those troubled areas where conflict zones are tougher and where there are forces trying to break apart the engagement, the structures of cohabitation that exists between farmers and herders in places like the Middle Belt in Nigeria, to get after those sorts of things. And so we helped enable, with a little bit of resources, African partners to get after those drivers of instability. So those are some of the reactions I had to this point. Thanks for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. I'm just going to push back quickly on your point about US engagement with foreign partners. If we want to be picky and be specific about US partnerships and US strategic partnerships in particular, and US military assistance, if we're looking at the numbers, I was looking at numbers from Security Assistance.org, and in the past from 2012, for example, US military assistance, and I'm speaking military assistance to Nigeria, which is the highest, recipient of US military assistance, was not more than $20 million US. And I understand that as much as Nigeria has a reputation, if you may, of human rights abuses and corruption issues, the question would be, does the US engage with African states on the same level that the US engages with states from the Middle East and North Africa, for example? Because in spite of existing human rights abuse issues existing in countries like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, and the lack of transparency in those countries, we see a more sustained and firm policy approach that the US engages with these countries. And we don't tend to see that on the continent, which is a point that I think that Ambassador Menkeros had brought up earlier about the need for firm and predictable engagement, that it isn't just ad hoc. And speaking and coming back to your point about the varied activities that the US engages through its various agencies in, say, Mali, engaging with civil society groups. Is there a possibility that you can have a policy that is more, that has a more predictable approach in dealing with and engaging with the continent in a more predictable manner, rather than having this ad hoc activities in these different countries? The issue that I'm trying to point out is that in as much as the US says it has these activities on the continent, we don't see it as a sustainable issue. African states, as the ambassador has highlighted, are in this constant space of trying to ensure that there is a sustainability in engagement between the two countries. I don't know if the ambassador would like to jump in before Ambassador Young responds to that. And meanwhile, I would like to tell our audiences to go ahead and send in questions, because we are soon going to transition into the questions Q&A session. So if you send in your questions, and we can start to collate them now. Ambassador Menkeros, would you like to step in before Ambassador Young responds?
Well, thank you, my sister, for presenting it in a very articulate manner. African institutions, when it comes to challenging or addressing atrocities and corruption and human rights abuses, have actually been at the forefront when it comes to abhorrence. In fact, have gone beyond where the UN is prepared to go into adopting a policy of non-indifference when a government forgets its responsibility to protect its own people. The African Union has decided it has a responsibility to intervene. When, for example, Ambassador Young mentioned Sudan, when there was a military coup against Bashir, even if it is against a regime that was hated by the Sudanese themselves, that actually had international engagements, that was a threat widely, the African Union decided that this was a coup. And there is a firm position not to accept any kind of new government change through a coup d'etat, and they suspended. I wonder what would have happened even if the issue had come to the UN Security Council, whether there would have been that unanimity. And now we are saved actually in Sudan, where the military that could have taken actually power was forced to establish a government led by a civilian in collaboration actually with that civilian. It is those institutions that have the principles that I know many actually, including in the US, would like to see challenged within the continent, that are the repository of those positions, if there was collaboration with them, rather than, as you said, selectively with a few governments only. Of course, the US has its own national interests also, and we will collaborate with those that have, in other words, that fit actually that partnership. But the institutions are the ones that actually have the principles, are intent on fighting, but lack the capacity in fighting. And I think emphasizing that part of the partnership while continuing on a wider scale with African individual countries also would be sustainable.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Young, the floor is yours now. I'd like to say that we are actually really coming close to the end of the program. And so once you've wrapped up your response to this, and I would like to also ask you to please respond and wrap in the last question that I wanted to emphasize on humanitarian issues, on more collaboration in a systematic way on the continent at the local level among communities. That would really.
Yeah, so I'll be really quick because I want to make sure we have time for the participants to raise. You know, the U.S. is really proud to be the probably largest donor on the African continent. We work all our programs in partnership with the host nations that receive us, and we implement them with partnerships and partners who are on the ground. So we're really pleased to have been such a strong partner throughout the years. And I cited the example of 30 years of investment, for example, in developing healthcare capabilities throughout the continent in ways that are sustainable and get long-term outcomes that enable African partners to get after things like Ebola. When I was in Mali, we had an Ebola outbreak. But who were the lead folks? Although we supplemented them with a whole bunch of injects, we were building on a framework and institutions that we had already invested in over the past 30 years. So I think that's getting at sustainability. So and I also think there's not much of a market in the United States for like Chapter 7 authorizations for a lot of these peacekeeping operations. You look at some of the UN peacekeeping operations, are they adapted effectively to get the security outcomes that we need on the continent? And that might not be the best tool. Our view is who knows best the security challenges in the country, but the host nations themselves. So that's what we do. We invest in the host nation capacities. We work together with them to say, they lay out their concerns, what gaps they have, and then we help. Said that I did that when I was in Burkina Faso. I think I got $65 million in the first tranche of G5 Sahel funding for Burkina Faso. But let's turn it over to the students because I would love to hear.
So before turning it over to the students, I wonder if we could articulate, just for the final round of questions before we turn to the students, if we could articulate in very short 1-minute presentations what the future holds, what to expect, what we want to get out of this whole discussion. What is the US possibly going to do in the next 4 years, and what will the African continent possibly do in the next 4 years to articulate and take advantage of this? I just want to do 1 minute, and then we'll jump into the question. Ambassador Menkes, you can start.
I think it is a fantastic opportunity that a new administration in the US has come that is ready to open up, to re-engage as had been in the past. And Africa is very hopeful and ready to be a partner also. And therefore, I welcome the very fact that this question is being posed is testimony to that readiness. And I think Africa is ready also. I discussed with so many in the continent, and there is high expectation to start this new, to continue actually what used to be with the new administration in the US.
I would be very quick and also support Ambassador Menkes' point that the U.S. administration looks to engage in alliances, looks to engage in partnerships, and looks to build prosperity from the grassroots in Africa. As I said at the very beginning of my conversation, General Townsend is engaging with senior leaders on the U.S. Congress right now, and there's a great well of goodwill towards Africa. We want to manage expectations in a way that don't get us out of sync, but I think we're going to have much more engagement, much more support for partnerships, and I'm very hopeful about the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. Let me jump into the questions. The reason, the first question that pops up here is the question, which I hope Ambassador Menkes can respond to, about the AU's failure to respond to what is going on in Tigray, so between the Ethiopians and the Eritreans. Is there a problem? Is there a way to articulate the AU's responses? And perhaps Ambassador Young can pop in there and also maybe pop in an idea about how the US is currently thinking about intervening in the situation. I know that recently that the Eritreans have finally considered that, yes, they had encroached into Ethiopia. So let me start with Ambassador Menkeros, and Ambassador Young can quickly jump in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the reaction of the African Union to the problems in Tigray, the civil war in Tigray, has not been what people would expect and wish for. The president, the then president of the African Union, did send actually a delegation of 3 former leaders, but because of the intransigence of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, that this is an internal, not only is it an internal matter, but it is a law and order situation, and therefore an internal matter, and we're not ready actually for any kind of mediation. And well, the African Union, yes, is an institution that has collective responsibility, but at the same time, its capacity really to intervene when member states are not ready has not really reached that level where it could force its way. There has been attempts, but those attempts were rebuffed by the Prime Minister, who said, this is our internal matter. We are almost, it's a law and order issue, and therefore you can't. So technically speaking, he is saying this is an internal matter and therefore not an issue for them. But the consequences actually on the population, the consequences towards the future of Ethiopia. There was a reason why Ethiopia was a federation. There was a reason also why that federation was based on ethnicity. Ethiopia was an empire, and empires either democratize or disintegrate. That's what happens. And therefore, it was an attempt to democratize that country. One wishes it wasn't based on ethnicity, but that was the reality. It came as a result of the fact that there were a Tigray Liberation Front, an Amhara Liberation Front, an Oromo Liberation Front, Afar Liberation Front, Somalia Liberation Front, not an Ethiopian Liberation Front. And therefore, the reality that was established reflected that. Yes, one needs to transcend that. But look how long Europe took actually to transcend that. And therefore, the ferocity of the war, the intervention of Eritrea also, which had a grudge actually against the TPLF because there was a border war, and that border basically is bordering Tigray. And there was a past actually when it was the Tigrayan-led government actually that fought against Eritrea, refused to implement actually the decision of the court. And therefore, they have intervened. However, it's an intervention in another war. Terrible situation coming. And I think engagement is necessary, whether the African Union does recognize it, does actually take the lead or not.
Okay, if I may, Ambassador Young, may I ask you, in the context of trying to engage Eritrea diplomatically and understanding how closed out it is and closed off it is to countries like the US, for example, would you talk about possibilities of engaging with Eritrean partners like the UAE, who are also strategic partners with the United States, for example, and how to come in diplomatically and resolve that issue? Thank you.
Well, let me speak to the very insightful points that Ambassador Menkeros raised about the issue in Ethiopia. The United States has engaged in Ethiopia. We've sent Senator Coons as a leader of a delegation, and that just this week we've appointed a special envoy for the Horn, Ambassador Jeff Feltman, who may know Ambassador Menkeros from his time in the United Nations system. But I think the fundamental point that Ambassador Menkeros outlined and that we all appreciate is an effort to end the violence and the consequences that are on the population are suffering. And I think that that's our desire and our engagement to try to get after that set of problems so we can get towards a better future of stability and prosperity in Ethiopia. Over.
There's a question here about the US and the AU and the steps that are being taken to intervene in the Cameroon crisis. Ambassador Young, could you respond to the questions around US engagement in Cameroon? You're muted, we can't hear you.
Can you repeat the question about Cameroon?
Yes, there's a question that says, what steps is the USA or the AU taking to intervene in the Cameroon crisis?
So we have just nominated a new ambassador for Cameroon. That's going to have to go through our nomination confirmation process. We have a chargé d'affaires in Yaoundé now. We have in the past identified gross human rights violations. And as a result of that clear investigation and determination, we reduced or ended some of our engagements with certain security forces in Cameroon because they were acting in ways that were not consistent with the protections of human rights. That's an example of the type of engagement that governs US security assistance globally and specifically in Cameroon.
Ambassador Menkeres, do you want to respond to that? And if you respond to that, then we can quickly move on to a question here about corruption on the continent and how international partners and can engage in a way that addresses the root causes of corruption on the continent in a way that is sustainable. The question really says, how can we expect increased anti-corruption efforts? If you respond to that, then I hope that Ambassador Young can also respond to the question of how the US engages with individual states and regional processes on the issues of corruption.
I think in both cases in Ethiopia and Cameroon, the demand for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the start of a dialogue, internal dialogue, mediated perhaps, supported perhaps by others, but dialogue that includes not only those who purport to be leaders, but also those who are subjects, who are the objects actually of the conflicts, and the consequences of those conflicts could be a way to start. This is the way to push, and there are some who are engaged in that process, but it definitely has not been the institutions that are supposed to be in the lead. It is rather other external institutions and personalities that have been leading that process of call to immediate cessation facilities and the start of dialogue, inclusive of, in other words, grassroots members as well, the population as well. Let me just summarize it in short to that.
Okay.
So on the issue.
Sorry, if I may, if you could speak to that and let's be a little more specific about how sanctions, whether sanctions have worked. If there are situations in which we have tried, the US, for example, has sanctioned, you mentioned that about Cameroon, on selected sanctions. Can you tell me if there is a way beyond sanctioning, if we can move and morph towards on the ground movements, working with CSOs in particular to help to mitigate some of these issues and to encourage transparency and accountability within the individual states?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that fundamentally, who needs to hold their own leaders accountable? But it's society itself and organized through civil society. So there are things that partners can do from the outside, but fundamentally the responsibility, and that's kind of getting at the expectations question that we talked about from the beginning of this conversation, lies with society themselves to hold their own leaders accountable. What can we do though to help bolster them? We do a lot with international organizations like things like Transparency International, that hold folks accountable. I talked earlier about the Mo Ibrahim Prize that the outgoing president of Niger just received for his exit from after serving his mandated 2 years and not seeking to extend his tenure in office. And then finally, one of the things that the United States does is we try to reinforce a race to the top in terms of good practices through things like the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So I mentioned that earlier, but that's a huge investment for many of these countries. And in order to qualify, there has to be progress on girls in school, fighting corruption, rule of law, sanctity of contracts, human rights protections, women in women's voices being heard. So those 20 categories that are externally determined are designed to drive and reinforce good behaviors that foster prosperity, and then will help enable who has the primary responsibility, which is those societies and countries themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. We will be closing the webinar in another 5 minutes. But before we do that, maybe we just delve into this last question from Sneha, who asks questions about China-Africa engagement and how that plays a role in the whole conversation about the US. If we can talk to external actors like the US and China and Russia and Turkey, and then bring that back to the US and quickly wrap up. So Ambassador Young, I'm going to give you 1 minute, and I'm going to give Ambassador Menkeros 1 minute.
Look, what is partnership built on? Common values, transparency, trying to promote long-term stability and prosperity. The United States looks at some of the actions of China in Africa in ways that undermine free press, undermine human rights, undermine promote corruption in terms of contracts. Those sorts of things are not in the long-term interests of prosperity. Today in the news, there's a story about Montenegro where they got this huge debt from China, and often associated with corrupt practices, and they're seeking to have external parties like the West bail them out. Well, that's an expectation. If partners in Africa pursue illegitimate infrastructure investments with China, don't ask the United States to bail you out if there's corruption involved. That, on the other hand, we know that Africa needs investments in infrastructure. That's part of the long-term growth of this fabulous continent that has a large population that's under the age of 17. So if that's done in a transparent, rules-based order, that's not something that we're going to fight against. It's the corruption that's problematic. Over.
Okay, so Ambassador Menkeros, to wrap up this section, and I hope that we can talk openly about Africa's actual infrastructural needs, as Ambassador Young has highlighted, and whether it is helpful to have this competitive approach on the continent.
I think the African continent, like all other continents or individual countries indeed, is going to interact with all members of the international community on the basis of mutual benefit. And definitely there has been an increased investment, loans through the Africom Bank, for example, for infrastructure in Africa from the Chinese. And definitely if that is available, Africa needs infrastructure without political conditions imposed, and therefore it has interacted and will continue to interact on that basis as well. What we would like actually is that the US, as a government with whom the African continent also had a lot of engagement in the past, continues on a more sustained and principled basis to become sort of a reliable partner in development. But that doesn't mean, really, I think competition is good. If there is competition that Africa can gain with, it will interact in the future as well.
Thank Thank you so much, sir, for your remarks. Thank you, Ambassador Young, and thank you, Ambassador Menkiros, and thank you for the audience for stepping in today and spending time with us. We have to bring the session to a wrap now. I'd like to really appreciate all of you for your interaction with us today, and we hope you continue to follow Science Africa and the work that we are doing on peace, security, and all the other issues going on the continent. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you take a step back and then come back in 5 minutes for the next panel. You can use the old link, just click back on the link and then you can rejoin the next session.
Thank you, and all the best to all those SCI students, and to you, Eloy, for organizing this event. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.